If you're an athlete, you know the greatest motivator of all is the fear of letting your teammates down. After all, a team is only as good as its weakest link. So you owe it to those wearing the same jersey as you to be your best every time you step on the field. That's why there's no vape in team. When you vape, you can expose your lungs to toxic chemicals that can damage your lungs. If you're a step behind, the team's a step behind. Brought to you by The Real Cost and the FDA.
So right away, I knew I wanted that. I wanted players to have a lot of narrative control in the game. And that doesn't play well with a survival horror game. Because if there is a chance to win, players will always try to do so because that's what games are.
Right.
And I realized right away after that first session that those two ideals could not play well. One would always ruin the other.
To say that 10 Candles had a huge impact on the RPG world doesn't give it enough credit. If you mention horror RPGs and 10 Candles doesn't come up in the conversation, you're in the wrong conversation. I sit down with Stephen Dewey and we talk about his history, both with RPGs and with live action role playing. We explore many of the games that became the roots of 10 Candles. He tells us how reading A Quiet Year by Avery Adler forced him to change how he wrote 10 Candles. And we have an amazing conversation about why the TTRPG community is full of designers that are so supportive of each other. This episode, like all the content coming off the third floor, is possible because of the support of the patrons on Patreon. Shout out to some of our newest patrons: Stephen Palmer, Kenneth Kosharek, Colleen Iberg, Spider 00X, Victor Wyatt, Lucas Falk, DOE, and Eric Salzwedel. Okay, sit back, relax, and enjoy my time with Stephen.
Okay, you want to see if you can tell if they're lying to you? Go ahead and roll. Sorry, you missed by 3. Yeah, you think they're telling the truth.
This is Sean.
And this is Navi.
And together we're a couple of Drakes, the creators of Court of Blades and Dead Bell.
When we're not writing games, we're listening to Table Talk. Don't
try that again?
When we're not writing games, we're listening to Tabletop Talk.
Welcome to Tabletop Talk from Third Floor Wars. Your host, Craig Shipman.
Howdy friends, Craig here. Today we're talking to Stephen Dewey of Calvary Games, the makers of 10 Candles. Stephen, welcome to the third floor.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. I've been looking forward to this ever since I found your little game and I took it out to the campsite. So every year, or twice a year, I have a group of anywhere from, 10 to 20 people that come out camping. And we do a whole week. And during the day, we do a lot of board games, card games, and things like that. And then at night, it's role-playing games. And in the last spring trip, I brought 10 candles, and we did it with no other light, just the 10 candles. First time everybody playing it, first time ever running it. And it was a huge hit. So we're going to get all into that. Before we do, you've got to be subjected to the one question you've gotten in every single interview you've ever done, but pretend nobody's heard your answers before. What I want you to talk about is your gaming origin story, right? So at some point you knew nothing about role-playing games or tabletop gaming, and then it was put in front of you for the first time. So can we go back there?
We can go back. Let me take you back on a journey of a young boy. I got into gaming very young. As much as I would love to give myself credit for getting involved in it. A bit of it was my older brother, who, when we were both fairly young, he himself got into games and gaming. He fell in with, a friend of his that introduced him to Dungeons and Dragons and things like that. And all of this I observed from a distance.
Right.
He never really got bitten by that bug as badly as I did. When I got involved in it, it was immediately, I was like, this is something I'm going to be enjoying for the rest of my life. And my first involvement with it was fairly diverse. While I did initially get pricked by Dungeons and Dragons 3rd edition at the time, that kind of spiraled off pretty quickly, because what I got into was a combination of D&D 3.0, a combination of a local chapter of live action role-playing gamers that my older brother was involved with. So I'd go off to my own campsite for a weekend, but I'd have a foam sword and a costume, right? That I was very into theater at the time. So that's just live action improvisational theater. And I loved that when I was in junior high school. And some combination, even in those early days, of sort of doing my own thing. Like, I distinctly remember when I was in junior high, getting a few of my friends together and running a game for them that was kind of D&D, kind of rules systems that I borrowed from live action gaming and somehow made work around a table, somehow just my own stuff, literally ripping off plots from whatever fantasy book I was reading at the time, and constructing my own thing that we played for several years before I finally actually got an official D&D group when I went to high school. I was invited by a friend of mine who was much older than me. I think he was a junior when I was right into high school as a freshman.
Right.
And he had a group that was these two adults, these two like full on adults that he knew, like family friends. One of them, their son, who was younger than both of us, and two high school kids. It was a very mixed matched group, but it was okay. Yeah. What we do is we get together every Saturday, and from noon until like 3 a.m. we play D&D. Something that is impossible to recreate in nowadays. But every Saturday I was there getting involved in that. That was chapter 1. That was the first act of me getting into gaming.
So I've got questions about Act 1 before we move to Act 2.
Go ahead with those.
So I would like to get a sense, for you to be, it's one thing for us to change the grappling rules, right, while we're playing and making little adjustments and stuff. But it sounds like to me you were whole cloth, like creating Frankenstein monsters at a very young age. Now, as an adult looking back, do you have a sense of what drove you to that versus, just reading modules and running the rules as written?
I feel like that age of just unbridled making games and playing them, that sort of came from that magical age where I didn't know that wasn't what I was supposed to do. Like, I didn't know what the rules were. I didn't know that, there's just a rule book where you can buy it and just have a game. I didn't know what I was doing. I wasn't involved in any of that. So no one told me how I'm supposed to do it. So I just sort of did my own thing. Only with the burden of adulthood do I now know what is not allowed. That's, subsequently pulled me down into just playing games normally.
And now you need a website and a logo and all kinds of stuff, right? So now let's talk chapter 2. So Act 1 is over. Let's go to chapter 2. You're just finishing high school?
So chapter 2 came when I was in college. Obviously, I'd left that group behind. I still was really excited about D&D. I started a club in college called Adventurers Wanted because there was no D&D club, where I went to school. So I made my own because I really wanted to keep running. And that worked out. And it was a club and it had university backing. And I got to buy rule books with money that wasn't mine. It was great. But one of them, and in addition to that, I kept doing I was still involved in live action role playing games, some of them local. I brought a lot of friends from college at the time on long drives up to Massachusetts because I went to college in Pennsylvania, but we did the long 8-hour drive to the LARPs I knew up and around there. So we were involved in that. That involvement from a lot of those people has actually spawned a very active LARP community in and around the Pennsylvania area where there really wasn't one before, just because I infected so many of those people with all of the things that games could be. But probably most significant to what I'm currently doing in gaming was one particular vacation where I went to visit some friends of mine in Boston. And one of my friends said, "Hey, do you want to play a role-playing game with us? It's called Lacuna." The full name of that game in particular, I believe, is Lacuna Part 1, The Beginning of the Mystery and the Girl from Blue City. And we sat down and we played this amazing game of secret agents and a strange city that we were operating within. And I was totally hooked on how imaginative and how weird and how interesting this game was, and saw that it was like a 75-page rule book, if even at the end, like 60-page rule book. And that was when I was first exposed to what at the time were sort of called story games. This idea of you don't need 12 source books for D&D like I'd been operating with. Here's a whole other kind of game that is designed to deliver a very specific, very intent-driven experience around a table that is not just a toolkit for a million adventures, but is a very, very custom rule set designed for one scenario.
Right.
And I was hooked. I was immediately blown away. I started like looking out and investing time in researching all these other story game systems that were big at the time, adding them to my collection, reading, and then eventually that turned to designing.
So so a couple things. One, was there anything between D&D and these story games? So did you get into Vampire the Masquerade was a big one around those times? I mean, was there any other games that you got sucked into, or was it straight from D&D to story gaming?
My the group that I played with in high school did introduce me occasionally to some other games. One of the big ones that they did introduce me to at the time was the saga of werewolf games. Right. So I played a little bit of Vampire. I played a little bit of Mage. And that's kind of continued. I've popped into the occasional Mage or Changeling campaign every now and again. They never really last long, usually go back to D&D. But at the time, I just sort of, because I didn't know any better, I just sort of looked at the Vampire games and D&D as just sort of, oh, these are the two companies that make games like this. When 4th edition happened in D&D, I did the split, as many people did, over to Pathfinder for a bit. So I ran plenty of campaigns there and played in some campaigns there. So I did start to see some of these other big box games that I engaged with, but nothing quite like story games until that first playthrough.
So you play, it was Lacuna was the name of it, right?
Yeah, the game is called Lacuna. It's by Memento Mori is the name of the publishing company. And it's this fantastic little game about things I won't even say, because I so much just suggest that people go and play that game because it's amazing. And it's so full of spoilers if you talk about it. But
good.
I went from there on to a host of other games that existed around the time, like Polaris was a big game that I played. I got introduced to all the games by the Bakers, Vincent Baker, McKay Baker, Epidiah Ravicol's Dread I became aware of and started playing around with. So a lot of these games, at that time, there weren't all that many. In comparison to now, where there is, I think, an amazing renaissance of independent designers that have grown out of Kickstarter and Itch.io and all these other Patreon and all these other platforms where they can create. And we have an embarrassment of riches
we really
out there right now with all of these wild and creative ideas that I love to see. I absolutely love to see.
So, embarrassingly, I had a preconception about LARPing, which I came by honestly due to lack of exposure. And I had Jason Morningstar on the show, and he straightened me right out and really helped me understand exactly, what LARPing really was versus, the perception that I've seen here and there as it's being mocked, quite frankly. Is there particular, it sounds like we talked about foam swords and stuff, some fantasy LARPing. Has there been other types of LARPs that you've really enjoyed or you think have had an impact on you as a player or even as a creator? What are some big LARPs for you?
Well, so, I have a long history with LARPs, and they have run the gamut, just like with tabletop role-playing games and how vast the variety is. It is very much mirrored in LARPing. There are, thousands of genres and types of games and styles. It's never ending, and I could never hope to encapsulate all of it in my brain at once. Sure. But I have, when I got started, I think the very first LARP I played, which was, not necessarily the best LARP I've ever played, but was what was local when I was young, was a game called Realms. And that plays all over New England. And I started when I was, I think, 13, all the way up through when I graduated from college. And it wasn't a great LARP, but it was very formative for me in just getting out there and doing the thing, and was my introduction to the hobby. I met a great number of very close friends that I keep to this day in the second LARP I played, which is a game called Legends, which ran out of Boston. And that game really showed me what a LARP could be, where it was much more centralized and there were ongoing stories and there was a huge history. And it wasn't just sort of chaos. It was very focused storytelling experience that I played for, again, like 4 or 5, maybe even 6 or 7 years invested in that game. And through those people, I actually wound up running or helping to run a game for 6 or 7 years called Steam and Cinders, which was a steampunk, very high immersion steampunk game. And from there, I also began to come into more of what are called parlor LARPs, or short form LARPs that you don't play 4 times a year in a long weekend at a campsite for several years, but you play once for 2 hours in a small room with 8 other people playing various characters. And those are these much, you think about some of those larger campaign LARPs that just last for years and years and years. And I think back and I think of maybe the 5 to 10 really amazing moments, like a couple hours that were huge highlights of that story. And then we have all these other designers who have just made games that are like, we don't need 10 years. I can just give you that moment in 2 hours. I'll just give you that exact moment. And then we don't have to worry about the rest of it. Like, that's what you're here to have that experience with.
Oh, that's cool.
So I am still exploring everything that LARP has to offer. I'm playing, I've been playing games that are never ending. I've played games or help run games that have a set, 4-year, 5-year, 6-year structure. I've played games you can finish in an afternoon. There's pulling out specific names probably wouldn't do much to help your audience or you, but Jason Morningstar is a great name to mention in relationship to LARP, because I've played a lot of his LARPs that are just decks of cards, and you sit around a table or sit in a room and play around with that. I mean, it's so accessible now with creators like Jason that you can have a LARP in your sitting room for a couple hours when your friends come to visit. It's incredible.
So let's talk about the design itch a little bit, Stephen. So, you're playing on the table and away from the table. And at some point, where did the gravity well start? When did you start saying, I want to create more than just at the table, or I want to create more than just this afternoon at the LARP? I want to create something that other people can consume.
There was, I feel like, not that long after I was introduced to story games.
Got it.
I had this realization after buying a bunch and reading through them. I thought, this is doable. I could do this. And I had helped to create, I'd been running tabletop games forever. I have had a ton of experience running games, coordinating events, all of these things. I enjoyed writing. I enjoyed designing for LARPs and things like that, writing rule systems for live action role-playing games. I thought this is something that I can do. And my first experience, the first sort of moment that the moment that 10 Candles sort of came into being was when I was playing a game called Polaris.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I have to clarify, there are, I guess, now 2 tabletop role-playing games called Polaris. There is one that I'm specifically referring to by P.H. Lee, which is Polaris Chivalric Tragedy at the Utmost North. It was released in 2005. And this game, from this game, I got a spark of inspiration that was actually in a large way unrelated to the game entirely. Then, so what I had done was I had run this game for some friends, and I decided that this game is very ritualistic. Mm-hmm. It has ritualistic phrases that guide it and resolve conflicts. It is a game where you really don't roll dice. You negotiate through conflicts. And what I decided I wanted to do to emblemize that ritual was to buy a tall stem candle and light it at the start of the session and blow it out at the end of the session. And our entire session would sort of be played by the light of this candle. And that would be because I'd run some D&D games like dungeons in D&D where I'll light candles and dim the lights. Like, that's really immersive. I come from a background of theater, of live action role playing games. I know that immersion is really important. I try to bring that to the table whenever I can. So I had this idea for, well, let's bring that candle here. Let's do that. And somewhere along the way, it doesn't say in the rulebook to do that or anything, but somewhere that stuck in my head of playing a role-playing game by the light of a candle. That's just immersion 101 right there. Sure. That'll get people drawn in. It's a lot harder to break out of that immersion when you just do something that simple.
Yeah.
That idea then grew into, well, what if that was a rule? What if, your role-playing session only lasted the light of a candle and not even like a big candle, a little candle?
Right.
Now, along the way, a lot of the design of Polaris and a lot of other games helped inform, I think, some of the roots that also grew into 10 Candles. The ritual, the tragedy, things like that also stuck around and helped inspire me. But oddly enough, it was that candle that sort of, lit the spark, both literally and metaphorically, to make 10 Candles happen.
So the candle turns into, candles being a mechanic, right? Mm-hmm. Or having that thought that we could do the candle more than just atmosphere. It could be part of the game. The first thing I would like to get a sense of before we dive even further is, is horror part of this conversation from you from the beginning, or is you thinking strictly mechanics? Was the theme developed in tandem here, or did this idea happen on its own and thematically 10 Candles, as a horror game came later? Does that make sense?
It all grew in tandem, I think. There were a bunch of small decisions that all informed each other. And the game grew out of that idea. When I tend to think about design, when I was first making 10 Candles, and you asked me, well, what are your design pillars, or what's your theory behind how you design? Couldn't have told you. Throughout the entire design of 10 Candles, I'd be like, I don't know. This seems like it's fun. I'm just making a fun game.
Right.
Weird, like now in retrospect, I can look back and be like, yes, I can see all the very intricate decisions I made based on game theory. So take everything I say with a grain of salt.
Of course.
But everything sort of grew together. It was an amorphous blob of a game idea. And when I had the idea of, okay, there's candles and the game stops when the candles go out, what kind of game is this? Well, if we play it only by the light of the candles, that's pretty spooky. So it would probably be horror. I wasn't like setting out to make a horror game.
Got it.
I just knew I wanted to make a game. And this was the first idea that sort of came to me. It very quickly became, okay, this is probably a horror game. But at the time, it wasn't necessarily a tragic horror game. It was probably more in the survival horror genre. I hadn't really crystallized what would make this game what it is or what would be important about it. It was largely mechanic based at the start, and what those mechanics would support and be able to support really well. And then the more fine-tuned shaping of 10 Candles came later as I was embellishing upon those basic ideas.
So pre the beginning of those 10 Candles, of the single candle and everything, had you either storyteller or in themes within D&D and some of the other games, had horror as a genre been a part of something that you have grabbed onto? I'm trying, because one of the things I'm trying to get a sense of is whether you were a horror player or GM before 10 Candles, right? Or was this also really your first deep dive into it as a storytelling genre?
I was an immersion GM. Okay. I was not, no specific genre ever jumped out at me. Mostly what I was engaged with was fantasy. Fantasy certainly has horror elements, and I certainly wanted to bring that. But from my experience with tabletop and my experience with live action and theater, it all came down to immersion, whatever the genre might be. So when I realized that I had sort of happened upon a mechanic here that that just bled immersion. Right. Horror is a really hard game to immerse people, a hard genre to immerse people in. But it was the one that sort of unquestionably was the best use of the mechanics as I'd come up with them at the time. So it was a no-brainer to do that. But I'm not like a horror guy. I don't come from, I love horror. I watch horror movies every week. And like, that's not really me. I like a lot of genres. But that was the one that fit really well for this. So as you start to piece it together on your own, when is the first time that someone else sees this? And when does that happen? What condition is the game in before it goes from out of your head and maybe to a notebook to, I want to throw this at you? And I'm not even talking to them playing it. Like when you start to have a conversation about it, when does that happen? Early, late? It happens fairly early. There are two critical moments where 10 Candles was seen by others for the first time. One of them was to my girlfriend at the time, now wife, who I shared the idea with. And she thought it was ridiculous, and no one would ever. It was just not a good idea, just a horrible idea. Which is a theory that she continued to espouse up until I launched the Kickstarter project, and then when it was received the mild success that it did,
that's great.
She said, "Oh, all right, I was wrong." I guess some people might enjoy that.
I guess there's as many idiots out there that are like you.
Sure, whatever. I mean, I stand corrected.
Oh, that's great.
But I shared the idea with her, and I ran the first ever version of that game as a very rough play test with her and her two roommates, Shelly and Dom, my wife, Nay, and myself. We played it. And that was, I can say, unless people have been going off book, it is the only time that I have ever run a game of 10 Candles where everyone survived at the end, or at least some of them did, because at that time I didn't know it wasn't a survival game. I hadn't pieced that together yet. They all got away safe, or most of them did anyway. They survived. No one has survived since. But we played it. We played with a really rough early version of the dice rules. But the idea of it, like I have that, alpha rule book somewhere in my collection of things, like 2 or 3 printed off pages, called 10 candles. There were 10 candles on the table. We played in the dark. All of that was there game one. The mechanics weren't really there, except that I knew the candles were going to be counting down. Probably the longest game of it I've ever run, because the early dice rules, it was a slow game. But I mean, the candles eventually darkened anyway, so that worked out.
Yeah.
But they had fun. They enjoyed it. It was fine. I mean, it was a game and it kind of worked. And even though a lot of the ritual wasn't there, a lot of the little tips and tricks and little hacks to get that immersion through the roof weren't there. It was very rough, but it worked really well. That was one of the two first touchstones.
So it's talking about that one, it's the first exposure they played. It sounds like it went well, all things considered, right?
Yeah.
As you walk away of that and you digest it, right? You digest the entire session. You start to question some things. You start, ideating. What was the impact to the next iteration at that point? So what were some of the immediate changes as a direct result of sitting with your then girlfriend and her friends? What was the next step?
The next step was, and many, many steps after, was really were two things. One was trying to figure out how these dice work.
Yeah.
Because I knew they didn't, but I didn't exactly know how they would. So there were many iterations of how the dice worked over the years. And the second being, I think everyone just needs to die at the end of this game.
What made you decide that?
I realized that, so a lot of the rules that I was playing with, one of the things I'd taken away from story games was this idea that doesn't exist in big box games, that is about giving players a tremendous amount of narrative control. And I knew that I wanted to do that right away. And there was a dice system that I'd kind of modeled my dice system after at the time, called Inspectors, which is also by Jared Sorensen, the same person who wrote Lacuna, Memento Mori. I think Jared is an amazing designer. So I owe a lot of thanks to Jared in this.
Sure.
But there was a rule system in Inspectors that was all about, you roll to see your success, but if you roll really well, you also get to have a word in what that success looks like. I can't take claim for that. That was right. Jared's idea. That's in Inspectors. Jared might have gotten it from somewhere else. I don't know. But that's where I learned about it.
Yep.
So right away, I knew I wanted that. I wanted players to have a lot of narrative control in the game. And that doesn't play well with a survival horror game. Because if there is a chance to win, players will always try to do so because that's what games are.
Right.
And I realized right away after that first session that those two ideals could not play well. One would always ruin the other. So I needed to remove one of them, and I wanted to keep that idea of player control in telling the story, which meant that they couldn't have control over the ending. That had to be just what it was. That had to be this tragic ending, so that players could really have the freedom to play in this sandbox, but to not go against the storyteller, to not have this combative relationship, but instead to work together. And that from that change, I saw an immediate reflection in, okay, this feels so much better than anything else that I've tried.
Well, it's amazing to me because I know exactly what you're talking about as far as, that expectation, like I want my character to live, right? I want to quote unquote win the game. I think you do a very good job of making it really clear right from the very beginning of setting those expectations. And it's fun because, suddenly I saw everybody at the table just go, oh, okay. Like there's no fight or anything. It's like, okay, so that's what we're going to do. And they get to ride their characters like they stole them, to steal that phrase, which is really nice. So you said, there was a second large moment where this thing hit the table. Can you take me to that next big one?
So the second moment was not really hitting the table in the traditional sense.
Okay.
But I brought this game to a PAX East. I had gone to an early PAX East. This was probably back in early, you know what? I'm not going to even guess because I'm going to be wrong. But it was brought to a PAX East. I was there. I actually got a ticket to PAX East because of Luke Crane, author of Burning Wheel, Mouse Guard RPG. Luke had gotten me in to, he had posted on Twitter, hey, can anyone come to PAX East and demo Mouse Guard RPG for me? I love that game so much. So I, not having ever met or talked to Luke Crane before, responded, yes. And he brought me in to do some demoing of Mouse Guard RPG. And I knocked it out of the park because I'm an amazing GM. But that's neither here nor there. But what I also brought with me was kind of a copy of the earliest edition of 10 Candles that I had at the time.
Right.
And this one had a little bit more written into it. I'd printed it off. I'd stapled it together like a real book. I had a few copies of it. And I chatted with Luke Crane about it, I think, but the big moment came when, so there was a booth there called the Indie Bazaar. And the Indie Bazaar was connected with the Burning Wheel booth and was staffed by a number of indie RPG creators that all pooled their resources to sort of have this booth together so they could sell their products. So Joshua A.C. Newman was the person who ran the booth, who designed like Shock and a bunch of other great games. The Bakers were there, Vincent Baker, McGay Baker, Ebediah Ravachol, Emily Care Boss. Like, it was the who's who of classic story games. It was an amazing group of people. And I walked up and I introduced myself and I said, I don't exactly remember, but it was something along the lines of, I feel like I'm soliciting, but I just wanted to come up and talk to all of you because I love so many of your games and I'm writing a game and I would love someone to take a look at it maybe and give me some feedback about what's worked for you and what hasn't, because I think this game is kind of in the sphere of what y'all make. Right. I'd love some feedback. So they were all obviously deeply busy, but I did, through that connection, I connected with them on Google Plus. Remember that? Google Plus, yeah. That's where indie games lived at the time. Yeah. And they invited me at the time to some, I don't even remember what they called it, but the Bakers sort of coordinated this semi-regular thing, which was like game design and coffee. And they're like, we have these things at like a super local cafe in Pioneer Valley in Massachusetts. You should come by sometime. Here's an invite. So I did the thing that any self-respecting fanboy would do. And I drove like 3 hours to join them for like 30 minutes of coffee one time. And it was the Bakers were there, and Joshua A.C. Newman was there, and a bunch of other people from various avenues of creation. And they all looked at me like I was crazy when I told them how long I'd driven. But I had my game and I passed out a couple copies and people were looking through it. And all of these game designers who I super deeply, deeply respect, after I gave like a 5-minute pitch, were excited about my game. And so that was all I needed. What were you feeling at that moment? I mean, that's incredible. Yeah, it was, obviously for them, it was probably much lower stakes. Like they probably didn't consider themselves to be design celebrities or anything like that. Like, they're just friends having coffee. Yep. So I was definitely completely overloaded in the moment. But I was, when like Joshua A.C. Newman was sitting next to me and looking at my game, and I was walking him through how the dice worked, and he started plotting out graphs on my paper to figure out like dice probabilities of how the game would shape out. And it was like, oh, this is really interesting. And people were like talking about it and excited about it. And I was over the moon. I was blown away. And there like wasn't a lot of feedback, but some people took copies of the games. They're like, hey, I'll read this at home and things like that. And while I didn't hear a tremendous amount from them, the feedback that I heard was really positive and really supportive, and was just, hey, make this game. It looks really good. you've got something here.
Wow.
Play test it, but like do make it. Don't give up on it. So that my first play test was enough to help me really find the heart of the game. And that was enough to carry me the next 2 to 3 years to making the game a reality. It was a lot of work, but that was enough to buoy me up for the entire process.
Yeah. When was the first time you saw the game played and you weren't running it and not playing it? And what was that like?
That took a while.
Yeah.
Whenever I was involved with it after its publication, I occasionally heard about it being played at a convention here or there, and that was always very exciting. But I never really saw it being played. I think my first real exposure to the game really being played by others took a while.
Mm-hmm.
And the first really crystallized moment of that happening was actually when I saw it being played on Twitch.
Right.
By channel Hyper RPG was the channel that was playing it. That channel was, or at least that game, I think the channel as well was run by Zach Eubank, who was actually like one of the main tech people, basically the stream manager in the early days of Critical Role. Mm-hmm. He was on like a big part of the Geek and Sundry crew back then. And then Hyper RPG was sort of this own separate thing. And I think that I had seen like there were a couple independent one-off games of it that I caught on Twitch here and there. And that was bewildering. And then the first really crystallized memory was was a campaign of it that was run by Hyper RPG, where they actually ran 10 sessions of 10 candles. And each of those sessions, I think, took they didn't finish a session in a single night. So each session took maybe 2 to 3 streams.
Yeah.
And they played through 10 full games of it as this massive, interconnected, strange season of 10 candles.
Yeah.
And it was unlike anything that even I could have imagined.
Right.
And it blew me away. I was in the audience as often as I could be. I was having a ton of fun. And Zach was doing things with the game I never even really would have imagined.
And can we talk about that a little bit more? Because that's what fascinates me is when you let go of the game and it's John, the way John Harper put it on the show was great. He says, I make instruments and it's great to listen to other people play them. Right. And so you're not there teaching Zach how to play the game. You're not explaining to Zach. Zach has got your book.
Yeah.
And then Zach is playing your instrument. So what did you see him do that you're like, wow, I never thought that could be in the game, or I never thought of that, or there's a gap between what I thought the game was and what Zach is playing?
Yeah, I mean, it was the first time that I'd ever seen the story grow beyond a single one shot, right? I think that is really what Zach did that I just haven't. I hadn't seen anyone do before. I have seen someone do it since, because I know that another possibly even more well-known example of this is that Ivan Van Norman ran, again, 10 candle sessions for Geek and Sundry.
Right.
So that happened after the Hyper RPG 10 sessions. He had run it as well, which was also amazing to watch. But this idea of this interconnected story, taking what 10 Candles is, which is really meant as a one shot.
Yep.
But can we examine an apocalypse or some horrible thing from 10 very distinct, very different angles and tell a story that we learn more about what's at the heart of it over the course of these 10 vaguely interconnected stories, right, but still definitely interconnected stories. So that was just amazing to see. And, it again, certainly wasn't the first probably game I'd ever seen. I think that even there was a YouTube channel, I think it was called like Nerds and Stuff. That might have actually been the very first time I'd ever seen it played, and I was so thrilled by it. But that was definitely the first time I saw someone take it and make it into something so different that it is now stuck in my mind as like, this was when 10 Candles really arrived, on the internet. And that was just amazing to see.
Yeah, that is incredible. So obviously for all of the time that 10 Candles has been alive and out there, you get questions about it, right?
Yeah.
And, a lot of times as a creator, when someone asks you a question, what the question they ask says a lot about where they are as far as understanding your game. So I'd be curious, can you think of what types of questions have you been asked to let you know they get it? Like, I've created a curated experience here. I've deliberately created 10 Candles, as a story game that is very focused. What types of questions do you get asked that you go, yeah, you understand what we're doing here?
I thought this was the much easier question to answer is what questions let you know that people don't get it.
Oh, that's next.
Because I certainly have plenty of those.
I tried to start positive.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a lot of the time a lot of what I hear about is people saying, I get a lot of, hey, here's what my idea is for a module. People will pitch me on here's what I want to give to my players.
Right.
And based on how the longer the module is, the more I get a little, maybe shorten that up a little bit. But some people give me like the real quick pitch. Yep. It's like, this is where they are. This is where they're going. I thought this would be fun to throw at them. What do you think? It's like, yes, short and sweet, evocative. All you need is that really good, juicy hook and you're golden. Yep. And when people come up with those good hooks, it's like, yeah, you've got it. You're ready to go. That's all you need is that hook. You don't need to overplan. And when people realize that, that's the moment I often get like, yeah, you know what you're doing. You know that you don't have to do any, like the work that you're going to do is at the end of the session. That's the work.
That's the thing, Stephen, that I did not. So there's one thing I love about this is you can read a game and you have to play it, right? And I think one of the biggest things that I figured out running the game was I was nervous going into it. Like, I don't know, like I don't have enough fuel here, right? I don't have enough hooks. I don't have enough thing. Man, I threw the meat out in the middle of that table just to get them started. And it was wonderful to watch them pick up and share the weight. And we ended up really just having some amazing moments as we went through that. And at the end, I'm like, okay, now I understand why you have these half-page prompts. Really, I mean, they're fat prompts at the end of the book, right? And that makes total sense to me. So what's the number one? I mean, outside of scenario design, is there other things that make you go, you know what? I don't know if you quite understand what we're doing here, or let me give you some advice. What are some things that how you've come across?
I think the biggest one is people will say, well, do I have to really tell them that they're going to die? And it's like, yes. It is so, if you take nothing else from me, it is so critically important that they know how this ends. Everything falls apart if that doesn't happen. Whenever I hear, that they want to keep it a surprise or anything like that, or that they want to take some power away from the players or anything like that, that's when it's like, no, it's so critical. Like, listen, if you want a game with a surprise ending, there are so many amazing options out there. Like, you should not be playing 10 Candles if you want any of your players to have a chance to survive, if you want the end to be unknown or up to the dice. Go play Dread by Epidiah. Right. It's amazing. It's the best survival horror game out there, and I will die on that hill. It's so good. You want body or existential horror? Go play Bluebeard's Bride. It's perfect. It's a perfect game, and you will get that, and you won't know how it ends, and it'll be a mystery, and it'll be great, and it'll be so good. Don't do that with 10 Candles, though. Your players will hate it. You will hate it. You won't have a good time.
Do you spend time with 10 Candles anymore? Or is that, have you put the top on it? Are we done with 10 Candles, or do you anticipate there ever being a need for another edition or more for it? Or is it time to start focusing on other things?
Well, 10 Candles probably isn't gone forever. While I don't see the rules system in vast need of fixing,
right?
There's definitely parts of the rules. I've had a Word document open since launch on Google Drive that is just questions I've been asked and advice I've been given, or, anywhere where things are fuzzy or confusing or just needlessly complicated. I'll get a lot of conversation. A lot of people will come and tell me, like, why do moments have to be in your stack of cards? Why can't we just have them to the side so that the narrative can let people live their moments when it makes the most sense in the story? And I'm like, yeah, you're probably right. Like, I tried a thing. It's okay if that didn't work for you. Like, you can do that. Maybe there's a lot in there that could probably be clarified. There's a lot in there where I could probably give alternate options right there in the rule book to let people know, hey, it's okay if you don't do this, because sometimes I feel players want rule books to give them permission to change things.
True. Yeah.
So if there was a second edition, and I've certainly talked and thought about doing a second edition someday, it would probably be a much more expansive product, right? It would be the rules as written with clarifications, small updates here and there, a lot of extra permission to change things. It would also be a much larger wealth of knowledge and guidance for GMs that are picking up the game. It would be, not 10 modules, maybe like 100 modules, because there's so many ideas for great modules out there. And I know people would enjoy being able to read through that. So there's a lot more that I could add to it and make it even like a multi-book box set, and really make the best version, big air quotes around this for the listening audience, best version of 10 Candles that, I could dream up. And then, oh, great, we're done with that now. Like, I can't release more, but I wanted to revisit it and just make it something a bit bigger, because there is more I could give.
Right.
Even though the game itself, while also being like, hey, if you own the old edition, you're fine. You don't need to buy this. Like, you're good. Yeah. Beyond that, though, there is actually a game pre-pandemic that I brought to a playtesting convention, really bare bones of a take on 10 Candles called 10 Candles Mysteries, which is a take on 10 Candles that is not a horror game, but it's a detective mystery solving game. Because hilariously, at a PAX I was working, someone came up to me. They asked me about 10 Candles, and I explained that it was a horror game, and they said, "Oh, horror. My wife would never play that with me. She doesn't like horror. Could you play it like as a mystery game?" And I said, "No." And then I put my finger to my chin and said, "Maybe." And I had this idea for a potential alternate variation on the rules. The 10-second pitch is, it's like 10 Candles, but in reverse, where you start with no lights lit, and the GM has all the power and the players have none. So instead of them wrapping up the game at the end, they set the case and the mystery up front. They have all the power and knowledge, but as the players gain clues and leads, they slowly light the candles as it shines light on the mystery that they're solving. And they gain more of that power. So then at the end, the GM, the storyteller, has no idea what the solve is for the mystery. And they allow the players to put together the solve that makes the most sense given the story that they've told.
So,
right.
Have you read Brindlewood Bay yet by Cordova?
I have not.
So I'm just put that in the back of your mind. The way that Jason handles mysteries and the idea of because it's essentially it's Murder, She Wrote in Lovecraft country, right? So you play old ladies that are part of a book club, and you solve murders in your little Massachusetts, New England town.
Yeah.
But what is fascinating about Jason's game, and it's iterated in a couple of on one other game of his too. I'm not going to get into it too. Just check it out. I think you would find it interesting because there's a small thread here that I think you would see between what you just told me, and that made me think of that. So, anywho,
duly noted.
The one thing I'd be interested about too. So you've got kind of maybe there's another 10 candles, and this is what there. Right. So it's kind of swimming around in the back of your brain. Do you ever find yourself reading a book, right? Reading an RPG and going, oh, maybe this is how I would approach another edition. Maybe this is how I would present, or I like how this person did this, and that would be an interesting way to present 10 candles. Have you had anything that you've come across that you've gone, oh, okay, maybe this is how I would approach a second edition?
Well, I have there's a little story there, and also just generally, well, one thing I will say is that I think the most informative example of how I might handle maybe the production and presentation of a second edition, if any of what I described in a multi-book box set sounds familiar, is because I rarely go all in on Kickstarters, but I sure did with Bluebeard's Bride. And that is just a beautiful piece of art in how they put that book together, and how they designed it and how they presented it. I mean, it makes me look at 10 Candles, because I did the formatting of 10 Candles all by myself. Yeah, I didn't know what I was doing, but I'm like, I kind of have an eye for design. I can kind of put this together, and it was fine. I mean, people don't necessarily need that, but I look at games like Bluebeard's Bride, and I'm like, this, it's just so pretty, and it's so well designed, and it's so, cleverly designed with how everything's constructed and how everything's presented. Absolutely right. If I were to put out a second edition, it would be, I would want to aspire to something like that. Yeah. But to answer kind of a question that you didn't ask, but a little bit was in there. I read RPGs all the time, and they absolutely guide how I design. And one of the biggest examples of that is when I was like doing the Kickstarter for 10 Candles, I had the game written. The game was done. It was ready to go. And I was at a PAX during that time. I was taking all of these. PAX is like the only con I go to, so that's why I keep talking about it. I was at a PAX East. I was with the Indie Bazaar, because I actually boothed with them after this conversation for many years. And I was just telling people about the Kickstarter, like I had nothing else I could do because I didn't have anything there with me. And while I was there, I went over to a booth of indie games, and I picked up The Quiet Year by Avery Alder. And I read through that little rule book. Yep. And like I was just sitting down at the booth, or maybe just like on a break. I read the entire rule book from cover to cover, and I went, oh no. Yeah. I have to go home and rewrite my rule book. Yeah. Because Avery taught me, I've never met the woman, but Avery taught me how to write a rule book. There was so much voice. There was so much of her voice in that rule book. There was so much ritual in how she wrote. There was just so much to it. Texture. It's just, yes. Yeah. It blew me away so much. I had written a rule book. Right. But Avery had written a story about this game. And it was so incredible to me that I went home and I basically started from scratch.
No kidding.
Just going back to sentence 1 and completely I'm like, I'm going to put myself into this rule book in a way that I didn't know I was allowed to do.
Isn't that something?
So a lot of, and some of the time, so I have to give continuous and never ending props and thanks to Avery, who again, I've never spoken with in real life. I've never spoken with in real life, but I cannot stop thanking her, because one of the things I get the most sort of feedback on from people who just have picked up the book, they will say like the first like couple of paragraphs in What You Need to Know right at the beginning, the first like 2 paragraphs about what this game is, hooked me so deeply and so immediately that I think you're an amazing writer. I really love this. I get endless compliments about it. I'm like, that did not exist until I read The Quiet Year, and I went back and I said, I'm allowed to do this. I'm allowed to just be poetic and dark and have my voice in there to talk about it. So nothing has really shaped what 10 Candles looks and feels and sounds like when you're reading through the rule book more than that moment. And that happens to me all the time. There's 100 other little examples of that happening to me. It's so true that every indie designer just steals mercilessly from every other one, and we all love it, and we're all made better for it.
No, it's you know, the what I love, you know, so very briefly, Stephen, I left RPGs for like 15, 20 years, right? And there was a huge gap. And when I left, it was all D&D, a touch of Pathfinder, a little bit of Call of Cthulhu, a lot of GURPS and stuff. I go away for 15, 20 years. The Forge happens, storytelling, and I come back and I'm like, holy shit. Like, what the hell's going on right now? And I've just been amazed at a lot of things. One, the community aspect, you know, went from we're going to play and not tell anybody that we play games and we'll like do it, you know, in secret, to it's everywhere. But the thing that I think is so fascinating is the strength of the community. And it's not only the community of players, the small player groups, but the community of designers. And, you know, community copies and, you know, putting out SRDs and without commissions involved. And it's really fascinating. And I'd be curious, do you have a sense of, because we don't really see that in the same way in miniature gaming, right? Or any other type of tabletop gaming. It's something that's very exclusive to RPGs, this sense of community. What do you think drives that? Do you have a sense?
Because all of us want to make it into a career, and all of us also know that we never can. I mean, we
want to live the lie together.
I mean, I think we all just exist in this pretend space where we can keep doing this. No, I mean, I think designing these kinds of games, and this might not be the regular and popular opinion, but I think designing these kind of games and having them be, you know, what we consider to be some amount of successful, it requires a level of vulnerability that a lot of other design spaces don't require from the designers. It is so much us. It is so much, you know, we are our writing teams, marketing teams, designers. We are the producers of the project. So many of us just don't have anyone backing us at all in this. There is such a level of putting yourself out there that just doesn't exist with larger scale operations. And, you know, you'll even with some of the, you know, again, air quotes, companies in the indie design space, it's not as much of a risk for them. Right. But I think that, you know, for those of us who are writing sad things on index cards and making these games, it's very much just putting yourself out there. There's a lot of that. And I think that because we know what we kind of understand, we have that mutual understanding of what everyone's going through. I think there is so much more of almost just like, it feels like an ethical requirement, an emotional requirement to go and support and to lift up others in our community. It's impossible not to, right? Which I think is why whenever there's any amount of drama or discord in the community. It's so strange because we all know that we're hanging on by threads and working day jobs that we hate and trying to make ends meet as best we can with this thing that we're deeply passionate about that doesn't support us 99 times out of 100.
Yeah.
I think that there's something to be said for a shared struggle. And I think that binds people together. And I was told very early on that a large part of being an indie designer is taking one crisp $5 bill and passing it around between creators over and over and over again, because that's just what we do. We see how much work is required. We see how much labor, physical, mental, emotional that puts into it. And the least we can do is support each other in making this art and trying to scream and yell over and over, this is worthwhile. Yeah. You should take a look at this, folks, because it's good.
That's really, really cool. So, guys, we're going to take a quick break. When we get back from this break, I want to talk to Stephen about another game that I came across. It's an ash can called To Serve Her Wintery Hunger. We'll be right back. This is the part of many podcasts where someone comes on, interrupts the show, and explains that you should consider paying for the content that you're listening to right now for free. That pitchman explains by giving $1 or more a month, you not only support the show, but you allow the show to grow and improve. Here on the third floor, we refuse to interrupt your episode of Tabletop Talk with such time-wasting pleas. We pledge never to run a spot asking you to go to patreon.com and give $1 or more a month, because supporting content creators keeps the content coming, even if there is a link in the show's description. And there is. We don't ask you to click it and become a patron. We don't waste time rambling about the benefits like early access to episodes, getting episodes without ad breaks like this, or even getting a chance to play in one of Craig's RPG sessions. Anyway, enjoy this episode knowing Tabletop Talk, despite being supported by its patrons, won't engage in such blatant appeals for support. So I come back from camping and I had never played anything like 10 Candles before. And what's funny about it is it had been built up pretty good. You were set up pretty well to fail because I'd heard, heard all the stories, and like a lot of my patrons and a lot of my audience knows how much I love horror. It's my favorite genre of RPGs. Like, have you played 10 Candles? Have you played 10 Candles? Fine, I'll buy the goddamn game on it, right? So I take it out to the campsite. And I remember distinctly the next morning digesting it all and just realizing what a different experience it was. And immediately went to explore what else I could grab of yours. And I think I read 4 sentences of To Serve Her Wintery Hunger, and I bought it. So I want to talk a little bit about it. For those, there's probably people listening who aren't as familiar with it. So a quick blurb. It's a dark fairy tale role-playing game of snow and pity. In this dark fairy tale, players take on the roles of wicked winter spirits hunting down a human lost in a deadly blizzard. I don't know how much time you spent piecing that together, but you're good at that hook, man. Like I read that, I'm like, okay, all right, how much is it? Print, yes, please. But let's kind of do a briefer version of what we did with 10 Candles. So at one point, nothing of Wintry Hunger exists. And then there's the acorn. So what was the first acorn that turned into what we currently have for Wintry Hunger?
Jonathan Walton.
Interesting.
Was the acorn. Jonathan Walton was a small part of, but an important part of 10 Candles when I was originally working on that, because I had at the time been looking for mentors, and Jay Walt had made a post on his blog a while ago that was basically saying, I want to help young, aspiring game designers find their way. And this post had come out maybe a year or two before I was really working on 10 Candles, but I reached out and he was willing graciously to take a look at the book and give me some feedback. And that was amazing. So I'd sort of stayed in touch with him. And along the way, he had at one point posted I must have been a tweet or something on probably on Google Plus, where he was putting together an anthology of games and wanted to do a project where he was making games about winter.
Interesting.
And I had at the time nothing but 10 Candles. But I thought this would be, I'd done some game jams. I'd done, some game contests where I had to sort of create something out of nothing. And over the course of a 6-hour design session, I wrote this game whole cloth out of my brain. I don't know where it came from. I don't know what dark forces inhabited me and made me write this game, but I had done a little bit of cursory research into not specifically into Japanese folklore, but into wintry folklore about like winter creatures and things like that. And I had learned about a Japanese yokai called Yuki Onna, who was sort of this mistress of winter. And read a bit about it and thought it was interesting and just wanted to write a game that was kind of a game, kind of a poem, kind of a story, but that was playable and was deeply just romantic in how I wrote it, and also a bit terrifying. And this game just came out of nowhere. And I had a game in a day that was like 14, 15 pages long. And that is sort of, with very minimal changes, the version that exists today.
So that's incredible. So you're telling me that I've got the PDF, my print copy is on its way. You're telling me if I grab that, if I break into your house tonight and steal that 15 pager and compare them, there's not that much difference?
There's not that. I mean, a lot of the difference came to cleaning up the text, formatting it, and, little changes here and there in terms of, how this character was made or how this question was phrased. But a lot of that came out of, a handful of small playtest sessions I made where things just need to be streamlined here and there. And I needed to, in one or two places, make it a little bit less poetically written and a little bit more focused on a clean game experience. Mm-hmm. And those handful of changes were really all I needed. And the game, is still an ash can. So it is, I'm open to the idea that, it's probably not that easy. And there might still be some feedback coming in out there whenever this game does reach its final form. So I'm still open to all of that. But yeah, it's not that different from the 6-hour design session that it was born out of.
So I haven't had a chance to play it yet, Stephen. So understand that my perspective is one of just reading it. And like I've mentioned, for me, reading a book and playing the game are two different experiences. But two things that I was really taken by was, one, it's very structured, very prescriptive in its structure, right? One GM, 4 players. And the perspective is very interesting. Who the players play is very interesting. And I guess in my head, I would have imagined that to evolved over time, but it sounds like you were going to play as these 4 entities right from the beginning.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. The names of the spirits have not changed. They have been what they are since the beginning.
Can you think, in the times that you have either watched it played or played it yourself or ran it yourself, because it's so unique, I want to try to give someone listening a sense of a moment that you can remember. So, can you tell us a piece of a story or something you saw happening at the table that really kind of captures what you want, what you expect from this game? Because I think it's so unique, Stephen. There
is a convention called Metatopia which is a playtest convention run by some amazing people in New Jersey. It's been not doing in-person events, obviously, because of, the world. But there was a night where myself and Liz Brink, and who's very well known in the indie design community, and I think a couple other indie designers, and we had woven a game together out of nowhere. Like, it was 11 p.m. at night, and people wanted to play a game, and I said, well, I've got this game. Let's go and play it. So we tottered off to someone's room at the hotel, and we just lay strewn about the room playing this game and telling this story. And I feel like there was a moment from that game where one of the players, like two of the players who were sitting on opposite sides of the same bed, physically began to embody these mischievous, dark spirits and were locked in a vicious transactional discussion about a fey bargain that that one party was extracting from the other. And these negotiations were filled with name calling and threats and horrible secrets that they were threatening to reveal about the other. None of this game takes 2 hours to play. None of this was written down, but it invites players to just get into the mindset of these braggart, arrogant, horribly evil creatures that are mocking each other and backstabbing each other and clawing to get ahead. And whenever I have played, when there's this moment that clicks where players really just allow themselves to be these horrible little monsters to each other. And I very intentionally try to set that up by even having the GM who's running the game be antagonistic and name calling to the players to set up this vibe of like, we're not friends. We are monsters here.
We are not a party.
And whenever I can see that, I've seen that embodied in so many of the games of this that I've run. And it's beautiful to see, because I'm like, yep, you get it. You are playing in this sandbox with me. Nothing in the rules is telling you that you have to do it like this or that you have to role play it like this.
Yeah.
But the rules encourage it.
Right.
With how they're written. And whenever that clicks, you can really tell when that clicks for a player.
So there's a lot of people listening, Stephen, that have only played with other players. You've played with players, and you just told me about a session with a bunch of designers. Mm-hmm. What's different when a bunch of designers play a game and when a bunch of people who don't design games play a game?
What's really funny, what I found, especially at conventions like Metatopia, which are designed as playtesting conventions. And if you go, you really are both there to show your games and to play in other people's games. I feel like there is an assumption that is understandable that people would make about this, which is, if you get designers in your game who are, if I see Jason Morningstar sit down at my table, which has happened before, oh no, Jason's going to tear this game apart. Jason is going to come at this from a designer standpoint, or, any designer, they're really going to pick at the rules. They're really going to shake the foundations of this thing. So deeply in this community is that not true?
It's amazing.
People who come there just to play, they'll pick, they'll prod, they'll poke at the rules because they think that's what they're supposed to do. It's a playtest convention. But the designers will come and they'll be like, I see what you're trying to do here. I love it. And I'm going to lean so much into it, and I'm going to lift the hell out of this game and play into it, because I think that will be more valuable for you to see than me being here as a designer. I am here to support you and to just dive into this game and live it as fully as I can so that you can see what that looks like and I can see what that feels like.
And that backs up the conversation we had just before, right? About the community and about all of that. And the perspective has to be unique that allows them to say, I know what you're doing and let's go.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So the last thing I always like to talk about is, we spend an hour or so talking about you making. I want to talk a little bit about you consuming. I would like to get a sense of, is there anything lately that you have grabbed onto, a TV show you've binge watched, a book series that you couldn't put down, a video game that stole hours away from you, or another RPG that you can't stop thinking about? What is something that has really got its hooks into you recently?
Oh, I'm always horrible at these questions. Let me think, because there's some like TV shows I'll be deeply binging that I don't necessarily want to publicly admit about.
That's fair.
Because I binge a whole bunch of garbage and I love it.
Well, I watch the housewife shows with my wife, and I've decided that I just need to tell people that because I can't hide anymore.
Yeah, that's fair. No, let's see. I think
what's something you've binged you're proud of, Stephen?
Oh, okay. I actually have something.
You're not ashamed of. I got it.
I feel like I very rarely have anything to talk about when asked questions like this, but I have actually been playing a role-playing game recently. And it's one of those, yeah, we get it. That came out like a decade ago, but I'm playing it now.
Who do you?
Sometimes it's hard for me to find a group. But I'm playing a 2-player campaign of Fall of Magic currently.
And I've heard of this, but I'm not familiar with it, so help me.
Oh, it's amazing. So the Fall of Magic is designed by Ross Kalman. It is obliteratingly good. It has no reason being this amazing. I've talked about this game in panels that I've led before, talking about emotion and how you can design mechanics to elicit certain emotions, which is something that I'm very interested in from a design perspective. And what Ross has done here is has designed a game that facilitates the emotions of awe and discovery and travel in a way that I've like the excitement of traveling to new lands that I've never seen done so well. But the quick pitch on Fall of Magic is that the game itself is played on a map that you slowly reveal as you travel from the western edge of the map to the eastern edge of the map. And every place that you go to has several locations, and each of those locations has scene prompts, and you tell the story of this journey. Mm-hmm. And you are playing the roles of characters that are accompanying a magus or magus, or however you pronounce it,
right?
Who is traveling to the place where magic was born, because in the world, magic is dying, and the magus is dying with it. So your characters are the companions on this journey. You play a little bit the magus as well, but no one player really controls the magus. You all do collectively. And it's this jamless game of travel and exploration.
Oh, that's cool.
It's one of those games that gives you very little except this map and these little scene prompts, but you create such an amazing organic story out of nothing. And it's absolutely amazing.
That's great. That's great. The closest thing I have to that is For the Queen, but boy, that sounds really good, man. I'm going to have to check that out.
It's incredible. And there's a version of it where you can buy, it's expensive, but you can buy like a cloth map that you literally, it's like a big scroll, and it's unparalleled in tabletop experiences, at least that I've seen before. So, so that's really what I've been playing. The game, the only other game that's really, I play D&D all the time. I actually run, one of the little side gigs I do on the side is that I run D&D 5th edition professionally. So I have like a couple of groups that hire me to run games for them. The only other game that's really been sticking in my mind tabletop RPG wise is one that isn't actually out yet.
Look at you.
But I have been obsessed with everything about it since its inception, which is Xenolanguage, which is a game by Thorny Games. It's the same folks that did Sign and Dialect, which are also incredible games. Xenolanguage is a game that is inspired by the movie Arrival, which is my favorite movie of all time. Wow. It's a game about first contact with an alien species and learning how to communicate with them. But part of communicating with them involves a deep introspection into the emotional tableaus of the characters that are doing so.
Right.
And I'm obsessed with everything that these designers have ever made. Dialect is one of my favorite games of all time. So I have been deeply excited for Xenolanguage. It was Kickstarted successfully. It's going to come out sometime soon, I hope, and I'm very pumped for it.
Oh, that's great. So, Stephen, there is a lot of really, really interesting, fun, and relaxing things to do on a Wednesday night, but somehow you made the mistake of coming on my show. So I want to start by saying thank you. This has been really fascinating. I had questions coming in. You've not only answered them, but you've created new questions for me, which is a good thing. Those are my favorite types of interviews. So I really appreciate you making the time.
Yeah, of course.
And everybody listening, you already know the routine. You can scroll down right now. Everything we've talked about is linked. You're going to want to go pick up 10 candles if you're like one of 3 people that I haven't already sold on it. But I really think that the big opportunity for a lot of you is to pick up the second game that we talked about. I had to read it twice to really start to wrap my head around it. It's a very, very interesting game. So everything's linked below. I really appreciate it, man.
Yeah, of course. No, I've loved chatting about this. I feel like we could fill up a whole second episode chatting about more stuff. So that's always a good feeling to have.
Well, you made a huge mistake. I've got your email address now, so I'm going to get you sucked into another. I'll get you sucked out of the game or onto the show again. Also, very quickly, for those of you listening, this is the end. You listened to the whole thing, and I appreciate you doing that too. Take care.
You did it. Congrats.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. Subscribe to Tabletop Talk and share it with your friends. Check out our content on YouTube and Twitch. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook and stay updated on everything coming from Third Floor. All the links are in the show notes. Take care, floorheads.
My friend, that was an amazing first segment. That was
great.
Exactly what I love to happen on my show, and I really can't thank you enough. That was perfect.
Yeah, no, I love talking. So
you're being very generous. It really is great. And we went places I didn't anticipate, and it was super freaking interesting. This is absolutely perfect. We're an hour in. I want to get a sense of your time so I know how much time to spend on this.
I've got all the time in the world,
okay.
I'm happy to chat for as long as you need.
Okay, great. Thank you. My plan is not to do a 4-hour show, but I did want to be conscious of it in case that you had a hard stop. All right, so I'll bring us back. Oh, hey, are you still here? Wow. Well, the episode is over, but if you're bored, why not go to patreon.com and support the show for as little as $1 a month? Yeah, you can just scroll down and get the link. It's Patreon that makes this and all of our other content possible. Don't you want to join the other floorheads on the Patreon Discord? Anyway, thanks for sticking around. Take care. Bye.